All right, Tim, thanks for handing me over the reins to start things here. This is, of course, a new Evangelicals Monday episode, and it will probably also be a Wednesday or Thursday episode of You Have Permission, my podcast. I'm Dan Koch, and I'm here today with Tim Whitaker of the New Evangelicals and Sarah Lane Ritchie. Sarah, I've tried to introduce you before on my show, and you quibble with my description. So please self-identify, self-describe your academic work.
My audience you've never been on the podcast before, so please, we would love to hear about it.
Yeah, happy to do so. Dan, I just listened to one of your recent podcasts about worship music, actually, and I heard you describe me as like a theologian, but no, she actually kind of likes to be called a philosopher. So I'm like not really either of those. Technically, my background and training is in science and religion. I'm just sort of a mashup between theology, philosophy, and the sciences.
Yeah.
So I'm like informed by all these disciplines, but an expert in none, which is a very uncomfortable place to be. So my academic work, so I did my PhD in Scotland, wrote a book on divine action, basically interfacing with like lived human experiences, and psychology of religion, cognitive science, neuroscience, and done a lot of recent work on psychedelics and things I call spiritual technologies. Basically, my whole gig right now is finding meaning-making pathways through engagement with the sciences and philosophy and theology, particularly for those who don't feel at home in traditional religions. So kind of the target group here is the spiritual but not religious, but also just like spiritually open, curious people who want something a little more serious than Saturday morning yoga.
Pretty good overlap with both Tim and my listenership there. Sarah has been, I would say she's a friend of the pod over at You Have Permission. I think you've probably been on, in combination now, 5 or 6 times on the show. And the first time you were on was to talk about kind of the concept that we're going to talk about today within a few minutes here, which is spiritual technologies, which you mentioned. We're going to come back to that because Tim has, what is it called, Tim, when in a complementarian church, the pastor gives, is it covering to his wife to like speak on the stage?
Yes, something like that.
Okay, yes. Tim has given me his covering to...
the umbrella? The umbrella
yeah.
is over.
Yeah, the umbrella of, what is it? Umbrella of what?
It's like the...
it's like the Gothard umbrella,
the headship model umbrella.
Yeah. Yeah.
And of course, it kind of the meme associated with this. Just Google it. Obviously demonstrates that nobody understands how umbrellas work.
Yeah,
but,
clearly,
yeah.
it's like a 5-layer umbrella.
Yeah.
Yeah. When you want to make sure to be really, you want your children to be extremely dry. You need multiple umbrellas over them. So, Tim has empowered me here. So Tim put out one of his funny 7-second videos a few weeks ago, and it said basically something like, when you deconstruct and realize it wasn't the spirit, it was just the drums.
That's right.
And this did very well, as typically, as Tim's memes often do well. And I immediately got in the comments and I was like, Tim, it's both. The spirit exists, then it's both. We got to talk about this, and we should bring Sarah in to talk about it with us, because this is her area of expertise.
You didn't tell me this was the prompt. I never would have agreed to this conversation.
Well, come on. You might not have been paying attention when I told you that this was the prompt.
And that one went viral. I think it has 2.8 million views as of this recording. So it really took off. It's a big one. That one took off. Yeah.
And by now, listeners may have seen the sort of response video that we made, sort of having fun with that, where Sarah and I each spit out our coffee because Tim's always drinking coffee. Anyway, the idea is like that. I know that you're kind of leaning into it, Tim. I know you don't necessarily think it is literally either the spirit or the drums hard stop, but I do think that that's the place to start, because there is an assumption. I think it's very widespread. I think it is within Christianity. I think it is within secular society. There is, I would say, a majority assumption in the West is that if something is God, then it's not a kind of a thing that we could describe, that we know how to do. So if it's the drums, if it's just that, Stephen Furtick's church went to the Sphere and learned all of U2's best tricks and they bring them back, then that's not God. Now, I'm going to be really tempted to lean into any version that tells me that Elevation Church is not God. But I'm going to have to fight that because I think that that's a unnecessary dualistic, to bring in some new evangelicals lingo here and use it against you. I think that's a dualistic approach that it either has to be something we can control, like with the fog and the sound and whatever, or it's the Holy Spirit, or it's the divine moving. So my first question is to you, Tim, and Sarah and I may have some things to add here. In your life, where do you think that background assumption came from? Like, to the extent that you believe it actually, and you're not just kind of having fun with it, where does that assumption come from? That it's either the drums or it's the Spirit?
Well, my first question to you, Dan, not to Sarah, because I know, Sarah, you're very busy, is did you read the caption in that video?
I'm sure I did, but how? But a question back to you. Answer your question with a question. What percentage of the viewers read the caption?
I would hope a lot. I mean, it has. I usually do a poll at the end of each one, and I think it has like 10,000 responses to the poll. Just for the sake of the community who can't see this, I'm gonna read my caption too, right? So essentially, what I did was it's me drinking water, and the caption is in the video, like the little prompt is
not coffee.
Yeah, it's water in this one. I'm trying to drink more water. Okay, I drink too much coffee. When you deconstruct, so it says when you deconstruct and realize it wasn't the Holy Spirit, ... it was just the drums, and the music playing is What a Beautiful Name by Hillsong Worship. Okay, and then here's the caption. I'll read it out to you. Before you pick up your rocks. This isn't about taking away from anyone's experience. I recognize people find a lot of meaning in these worship spaces. As a drummer for 22 years in that space, there were many moments that meant a lot to me. But even while I was still a drummer playing every Sunday, I recognized that there was a manipulation going on. Music is a powerful gift. It is inherently emotional, and that's fine. The danger becomes when we conflate the music with God. Many people would experience an emotional high led by music designed to create atmospheres of contemplation, awe, and beauty. They would walk down an aisle and declare that God had set them free of a sin, but they'd be back the next week doing the same exact thing. This happened to me numerous times throughout my decades in the church. These moments weren't permanent, and they created, I believe, a sense of dualism that God was showing up here in this worship environment, but God wasn't with you on Monday morning in the mundane of life. So that's the caption I wrote.
I love that as an answer to my question. So to sort of wrap those two together, and yeah, I'm not giving you enough credit for the caption. I'm kind of leaning into that, right? We got to create.
You should.
Podcasts need conflict. Okay,
I'm all about it. I'm all about it.
The only canonical text is the text in the meme.
That is arguably true.
The caption is deuterocanonical. Okay, the Catholics accept it, but not Protestants.
Yes.
No one really reads it. We got 1% of the viewer accounts have left to have answered the poll.
100%.
So no, but okay. But anyway, that being said, so it's actually a really interesting answer. Your answer is, well, the dualism comes from what I would hear from congregants who would they would have this experience that we had meticulously crafted to help them have this transcendent worship experience. But what they would come to think of it as is, well, that's the moment when God's there and I'm being delivered of sin. Like when you say I was delivered of a sin while I was singing a song, the kind of language I would use for that is, wow, this aesthetic experience, this musical experience is spreading out into other areas of their lives. It's touching their will and their selfishness and their addictions and whatever. So it's this really powerful juice that's kind of getting into their system, and such that they would talk about it as if that's God. And then I go back into my life and I mess up. And so then God's not there. And that's where some of the dualism is coming from, which is really interesting and not kind of an angle I would have thought to take.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to dominate the conversation, but I just have so many thoughts on this because I spent so much time in these spaces being on the band side of it, doing like very high-end production, full light, full fog, full everything, MD, a music director in your ears calling out shots. So, and I really want to hear Sarah's thoughts on this based on this word that you use, spiritual technologies, which I love. I'm so intrigued by. Yeah. And Sarah, just so you know, I'm not sure if you know this, I am not an academic. I have some college under my belt. So I always try and level set, like I'm coming from the experience side of this and not so much like the philosophical or even theological side. I'm still learning a lot about that as I go through this journey. But yeah, I mean, essentially what it comes down to for me is after being in that space for so long, I noticed this. I'm not even going to call it intentional. I'm going to say it was an unintentional byproduct of these atmospheres that we were creating. I mean, there's the Elevation song that literally says there's something changing in the atmosphere because the Spirit of the Lord is here, right? And it's in like this, it's actually shot really, the song itself is killer and it's shot really well. It's in a huge stadium. But like those kinds of lines, I think reinforce this unintentional sense of dualism that, okay, in this moment, God is here in a different way than when we're in our Monday morning routine. At the same time, and Sarah, you'll hear me be full of contradictions. I'm always wrestling through. I do think that there are unique moments in life and that there's something powerful about being together in a room with people, focused on something and using music to tap into that, right? So I don't want to discount what that can be. I think the problem for me is that I eventually started calling them sugar rushes. I said, this is a sugar rush moment. Is sugar always bad? No, it's not bad to have dessert or have, some sugar here and there. But when that's all you're used to are these super intense moments that are built visually and musically to invoke these really intense emotions. And when you do that week after week and you start conflating the Holy Spirit or how God moves through the world with like these musical moments that are not for nefarious reasons, but they're just intentionally designed to invoke a sense of awe and wonder. I just think that a lot of people create or start thinking about, I guess what I'm saying is they can't separate the music from God. So yes, my little caption was to a degree tongue in cheek, but at the same time, for millions of us who were either active participants in that moment or were passive spectators in that moment, there was a time when we go, wait, am I feeling this way because the Holy Spirit is doing this or because this drum build is really emotional and it's like 100 dB in here? And of course, I noticed this quickly on my end being a drummer where I would be in these charismatic spaces at like these different retreats, a men's retreat, a women's retreat. And I would notice, I'm like, when I start building on the toms, people start really speaking in tongues, and people start rushing the aisle.
Yeah,
and I started noticing these patterns, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's where a lot of this is coming from. For me, it's just being in those spaces, whether it's youth. I mean, I played a creation festival. I've done so many things. I'm just like, I don't think music is bad, but I feel like the church, again, I'm going to put it in the best light possible, is unintentionally almost weaponizing music to give people this sense of your chains are broken. I mean, let's just go with the classic. I watched porn this weekend, but I repented and God broke me free of my porn addiction, quote term used loosely. And then like that next week, oh, I fell in sin again, brother. It's like, okay, well, is God setting you free or not? Like what's actually happening here, right? So I just think that's a lot of the background for me that filled in that image that maybe then go, here's a funny one to do, post. And then 3 million views later, here we are talking about it.
Totally. I love it.
Those are my thoughts.
I'm going to let you jump in, Sarah.
All right. So there's so much here. Yeah. And I want to first say that I completely agree with and empathize with the impulse behind what I take to be the meme and the caption, which I haven't seen yet. So I got the vibe. I completely understand the impulse. I think it's the right impulse. I also have that impulse. I can't stand going to evangelical churches, but I still listen to worship music all the time on my own. So the impulse, I think, is the right one, right? I think the reaction is the wrong one. So I will unpack this. So I think the first step here is to try and understand the ICK Factor. What do we so hate when we go into an evangelical church and we hear the 4-chord songs and we see people like, being like dramatically delivered, and then like 3 days later, they're like the exact same person they were on Friday. The ICK Factor needs to be unpacked, right? So I think, so what I notice is that for those of us who were once in evangelicalism and are not anymore, or like at least a particular flavor of evangelicalism,
right?
A lot of the ICK Factor is not only what's happening on Sunday morning, it's also the ickiness that has built up around that Sunday morning experience for us in terms of theology, action, behavior, relationships, like views we find abhorrent, right? And so your caption identifies a very particular sort of like critique. Okay, these people are basically attributing to God what should be attributed to like emotionally intense music. So they are conflating the spirit with the human, and we should just like resist that. So there is a sort of, there's an irony here because you're basically charging them with being dualists. You're saying like, hey guys, you're saying everything is about the spirit, but in fact your body and your emotions are involved here. But then the reaction that you wrote basically says, well, I would say that it also, ironically, falls into dualism. So you make a dualist charge, like you guys are like, you're basically telling them, hey, you're saying it's God, but you're forgetting all about the body. You're forgetting all about like the role of the emotions and like this, what I would call spiritual technologies. Like you're not recognizing that your emotions can be manipulated. So that's an anti-dualist charge that you're making. But then the critique in your reaction is also dualist because you're like, we shouldn't do that. We should instead retreat into the land of theology or social justice or whatever. I don't know what you would say we should like go to in reaction. So, but I do think that there is this very common irony, especially amongst evangelicals, and also I would say even in like academic theology, where there's a sort of a critique of evangelicalism's dualism, but they resort to dualism themselves when they're making that critique. Okay, so. I understand the impulse, but I think that there's something a little bit off about just a simple critique of what's happening. So my own work in this area comes from many places, but I would say like primarily came from my own childhood and background in evangelicalism. I absolutely loved the most intense, like immersive worship experiences. Do you remember Acquire the Fire? Have you ever heard of this?
Oh yeah.
Like Acquire the Fire, Teen Mania, like it formed me as like a young teenager. And
it just spiked my anxiety by mentioning Acquire the Fire. It's going to take me 5 minutes.
What did she just say?
All right, I'm just going to lead the audience really quickly. Okay, now you're watching your leaves float. You're watching your thoughts as leaves float down the stream. And right now you're having an anxious thought about Acquire the Fire, but just watch it go in your mind's eye. Okay, Sarah, we're back.
A little mindfulness intervention there. I love it.
Yeah, a little mindfulness practice.
All right, so I come from this world. I totally understand the power of music, and I understand how it can make you feel closer to God than you've ever felt in your entire life. And if you haven't come from, so I grew up in a Southern Baptist church in my early years, and I hadn't really ever experienced intense, like immersive worship music until I was 13 and went to an Acquire the Fire thing. And it changed me for years. Honestly, it was like the most powerful thing I'd ever experienced because I hadn't experienced it on a regular basis. Okay, so I totally understand the pull. But as I got older and I started like pursuing an academic route in science and religion, I basically pursued that course because I didn't really find belief in God and connection with God very easy. And I would even say impossible. Like I never experienced what anyone else seemed to be experiencing.
Right. This is how our friendship started, by the way.
Yeah. This is called the problem of divine hiddenness in theology, where you basically, like I've always been a person who longs to experience God, but doesn't, or at least not in the way that I want to. I haven't ever really felt connected to God in a way that felt like it was bringing me peace or contentedness or hope or wholeness, right? So always been plagued by despair. This could be a dispositional thing, whatever. But for my PhD and since then, actually, I've been really trying to tease out like the issues that are involved in claims that God is acting in us, right? So is God acting in the world, in our minds? What does that mean? Are we active participants in that? Is that okay? If we don't experience God and want to, is there anything we can do to curate experiences and practices and whatever that are going to make it more likely that we experience God in a satisfying way? So that's where I start using this term spiritual technologies. And so if I have like one theological argument, it's probably that it is completely fine to engage in practices, habits, experiences, even if they're emotionally intense, in service of spiritual ends or goals, because that's how humans have evolved. That's who we are. We are like biological, psychological organisms that have to work within a certain set of parameters and realities. And we have to expose ourselves to so-called manipulation every moment of the day. We are always choosing to be acted upon by experiences and communities and emotions. We are always doing this every single day. And it is both erroneous and disingenuous to suggest that the evangelicals are being manipulative, but the rest of us are not. And one final thing I would say at this point is that my hunch is that the reason so much ire is currently being levied against the evangelicals is because their particular flavor of worship is I hesitate to use the word innovative because it sounds too complimentary, but it's relatively recent. These are new things, right?
For sure.
It was innovated in the 1980s by The Edge and Bono, but that's
then
still
Darlene Zschech picked up on it. Here we are.
And then that's still in the grand scheme of time of Christian tradition. That's still pretty recent.
That's right. So there's a lot more. So the potential for manipulation is much more evident and irksome when it's around using like fog machines and ripped jeans and like tight t-shirts up on
and
stage
also
and
cultural colonialism, essentially, right? Where it's like we're exporting Western pop culture with our gospel, around, and that can feel icky too. Yeah.
But the historical error here is that we never make the same charges against traditional worship.
Okay, I gotta jump in here. You're gonna take my example if I let you keep talking, Sarah.
Wait,
no, can I say one more sentence?
Yeah,
One more sentence.
I'm worried. I'm really excited about this point, and I'm gonna be bummed if you beat me to it. Go ahead.
Well, okay. I mean, there are many things that one could say here historically, but there is nothing fundamentally different between what is happening at Hillsong today and the smells and bells of the high church throughout human history, or the hymnody, like the hymns that were cutting edge at one point throughout history, and were also designed to elicit emotional responses.
That's right.
So there's fundamentally no difference between what was happening in the 13th century and what is happening now. It is
what is happening before. I can't help myself.
Right, go ahead.
Or what was happening in the church building right before everybody got out on the road in Selma. And you could be, what if someone was in there making a meme when you thought it was the Spirit moving, but you realized it was just the choir?
Mm-hmm.
And it's the gospel choir, gearing everybody up to go face fucking fire hoses and police dogs. And so we would, and I'm not accusing you of this, Tim, but I'm just saying we would not be as liberals. We would be like, oh, how great that they utilize the church and all this stuff to like give people help them with the courage needed to lay their lives on the line for the civil rights struggle.
Yes.
But it's the exact same stuff we're talking about. It's
okay.
Okay.
Wait. Look, here's my last sentence. I swear it's my last sentence.
No, go ahead. Sarah, you're good. You talk.
You're good. Dan needs to shut the fuck up. Yeah.
Dan teed me up for what is basically my thesis statement in life, which is that we cannot help but be physical, biological organisms that are going to experience emotionally intense things and have a lot of changes in our cognition and our beliefs and our actions in response to those emotionally intense experiences. And that is fine. We have to stop with the value judgments about that and not say, oh, if it's emotionally like blah, 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 if it's a sugar rush, then we should just avoid it, because that is not how humans have evolved. We are feeling creatures who have always been seeking transcendence, always been seeking connectedness, always been seeking the collective effervescence in Durkheim's language. And we have, if you're going to accept who humans are, and if you believe in a God that creates, then you got to accept how God has created these organisms that we call humans and just roll with it. So I think the wrong response is to say, let's not be emotional or like curate experiences. The right response is to say, we cannot help but do this. This is always happening. So let's be intentional and responsible about it and ethical. And then also use these spiritual technologies to actually help people experience something that could change their lives and also the way that they are engaging in the world.
Yes. So first off, I agree. I'm not sure if and it probably was the intent because of how snarky my little line is. It's probably communicated that, the other response is then no emotions, right? Like all emotions are bad in church or something. I don't agree with that for sure. And you're right. I mean, to be fair, right? Like Gothic architecture, big, tall buildings, stained glass windows. That's the modern, that's the ancient version of the light show, friends, and like the reverb. So like there is a normal, like you said, Sarah, better than I could, part of the human experience that we like these sensory given things, and like they help us make sense of things. I even think about like, the paintings in the Catholic Church, right? Like there's always, the arts have always been used to kind of give people what is unseen, a version of what it might look like, right? It's part of what we've always done. And actually, we should be thanking our Catholic tradition or friends on the other side for helping us kind of get along and like realize how the arts have a lot of value here, right? I agree with all of that. I think though, and to Dan, to use your example, the difference between whatever is happening before Selma and Hillsong is that one says, if you're gay, you're going to hell. Another one says, we can use this to fight for a more inclusive, better way forward, right? And so the crux of what I believe, at least, I'll just use me. I can't speak for my audience or people out there. I can just tell you the reason why, and I'm still working through this. I'm still quite traumatized. I'll explain that in a minute. But the reason why I'm so maybe harsh on this is because of how it was used to weaponize as a weapon to really keep people in power and control at the expense of others. And it costs a lot of people their sanity, whether it was, God's given me a word for you. You shouldn't or should do this. Or it was used to tell gay people that you're set free of your gayness, right? So I agree with you. I'm a musician. I play in cover. I play in bars. I was at Point Pleasant, Sarah, this past Sunday. You know where that is because you're in Jersey. Playing Jenks, okay? 300 people, most of them drunk. They just want to have a good time. I'm playing Backstreet Boys. They're going crazy. It's an emotional experience. I'm not like, oh my God, am I manipulating them? No, I'm not. If I am, they want to be. It's fine. Yeah. That's the difference for me, though, is that I think that once you put in the God card in play, right? How we use those things to push people towards that human flourishing or towards their own self, deprecation or their own sense of like how horrible they are. I think that's when it gets really dangerous. I think for a lot of people, in particular, in the white evangelical space, right? A lot of us come out deconstructing and we start rethinking everything and we go, wait a second. Yes, I knew it was emotional because of the music, but it was used in a way that was so detrimental. And actually, it's funny, maybe last year, I was at a very large megachurch, like one of the biggest. And they had this event that was pretty much helping parents of queer kids navigate how they don't have to lose their faith or lose their kid. They can love their kid and still love their faith. And the panel was a completely queer panel. It was like a trans man, it was a lesbian woman, a gay man, etc. And they're all Christians. And they're singing these songs about God's unconditional love. And I get chills even saying it now because I'm in this room and I'm like, wait, what if these songs actually meant what they're saying? And then I had this visual of this panel of all queer people raising their hands in worship to God for God's unconditional love. And that was a moment where I went, is it that the music was inherently bad, or was it how it was being used that makes me so fucking pissed about this whole thing I went through? And I think it's more of the latter than it is the former, right? And so I think that's a distinction for me as I've been growing. And the last thing I'll say, that I'll get back to you, I'm still, just full transparency with the audience and with you guys, I'm still working through my own resistance to feeling emotional in sacred spaces. Last beer camp, right, we had this moment where Flamey Grant sang songs and we passed out communion. And my God, I fought like hell. I said, no, I am not going to be manipulated again into thinking that this is a safe space where I can be fully accepted and that this, because it felt too good to be true. Now, another friend of ours, and this is public, Sarah Heath, she's weeping. She's just bawling and we're all hugging her. I'm like, I'm back in youth group again. But again, it was a moment where I thought, first off, that's part of me navigating my own, like evangelical stuff. But that was a really powerful moment for her. Like it really was powerful for her. And so I'm with you on that. Like, I don't think it's bad to have these emotional experiences. I think a lot of us are wrestling through how they were used in our previous tradition and how much damage they might have done to people, including ourselves.
You're raising all the right, like, issues, all of them. And side note, I love Sarah Heath. We were together at beer camp 2 years ago, or 2 years ago. And like, we just like locked ourselves in a room and like cried and laughed together. It was so good. It's the first time I'd met her. She's wonderful.
She is. She's great.
Okay. So like, I agree. I completely agree that like the cultural reaction against evangelical worship music is completely understandable when you think about the ways in which we have been like harmed by the church. Okay. And so like me, as much as anybody, probably, in fact, because I'm a woman, like more so than most people.
Yeah.
And I could get into details. I have on Dan's podcast many times, but like, I would say, I mean, I do not use the word trauma lightly, but I would definitely say that the linkage of worship music with theological content and actions and words from the community absolutely led to something I would say is like spiritual trauma for me, religious trauma. And that also affected every other area of my life, right? It affects your physical health, your mental health, your relationships, everything. Mm-hmm. So it's not just like, oh, my spiritual trauma. It's like, it affects absolutely freaking everything.
Totally.
Yeah.
So I am with you. Like, I cannot stand going to evangelical churches because the music, as good as it might be or powerful as it might be, is almost always linked with content, like either in like the lyrics, or in like the sermon and the verbiage around it, that is super, super harmful. One problem here is that, harmful can kind of be in the eye of the beholder. No person at Hillsong thinks that they are damaging everyone. Every single person there thinks that, yeah, this is like harsh truth. But like, if you listen to us and you submit to God, then your life will be changed and you will be better in the long run and for all of eternity, right? Like, we are trying to do the hard thing for you and telling you that this is sin and you must repent and all these things, right? So nobody
just really quickly add in, as a trauma clinician, they're also not harming everyone. They're harming some people and not others. And it's not immediately obvious who's being harmed or not. We could come up with a couple categories like openly queer people, and women who feel a call to ministry. Like, those are the two categories that I'm like, okay, pretty confident that this teaching is, at least harming those people kind of directly. Beyond that, harm and benefit gets a lot harder to suss out. And so even at a Hillsong event or whatever, there are plenty of people there who actually don't give a shit about the sexual ethics of that church. And this is just like an uplifting experience for them and their family that for the most part helps them and then even helps their community. That's hard for us because we want to be advocates for the people who are in the pew next to them being harmed. And that's true. But it is like, it's hard to get our minds around it. Like, it's just like PTSD in battle. The same soldiers can view the exact same, be a part of the exact same experience. And one gets PTSD and the other doesn't. And like, that's just something that psychologists are still working on. How do we understand how this works? But harm and trauma just are not one size fits all. And anyway, sorry, just wanted to toss that in there as a trauma clinician.
So basically on every level, it's very, very difficult. On every dimension, it's incredibly difficult to reach some sort of objective understanding of like when a church is being like harmful in its theology. Because even like what I would consider to be the most abhorrent views, say about gay people or women or whatever, or Trump. I mean, God, there's so many options.
There's a lot
like all the different views for the people that are in these circles. For people who are in these circles, though, they're not abhorrent. They are going to lead to flourishing within their worldview, right? So as long as you like operate within this little package, you're going to pursue flourishing, and it's just part of the deal. Like, these views that I think are horrible are part of the deal, right? Okay, so that's one issue, is that like it's a challenge really to figure out how to do that when nobody can agree on what will lead to flourishing. But like,
actually, really quick there, Trip Fuller from Homebrew Christianity, he has a great thought experiment for this. He's like, try and guess what our kids who are doing their own progressive religion podcast will look back at us and say, and he's like, maybe it's like Can you believe? I mean, they said that they were progressive, but they were eating animals. You know,
Yeah,
or maybe it's that.
I think it's going to be vegetarianism.
Maybe it's vegetarianism. It might be something else. I don't know. It's actually very hard to predict the future. Turns out, it's actually
or like fast fashion, maybe like fast fashion.
Yeah,
I feel
fast
like
fashion, maybe.
Certainly
climate stuff, or some technological company will solve carbon capture. And I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. But like that can be helpful to be like, so we're doing that to groups that are a mixed bag because we can identify the things that are bad about them. But those groups are, you know, they're full of some bad actors and they're full of some genuine actors who are wrong about something and they don't know what they're wrong about. And we don't know what they're wrong about and we don't know what we're wrong about. And it's hard to zoom out there with time.
Well, I think that there are a lot of people out there who are like us, right? Who kind of hate what we perceive in our kind of historical moment to be really shitty. Do you swear in your podcast?
Please,
really
please
shitty theology. Sorry.
Haven't I already said the F word, or was that my earlier podcast today?
I don't know. It's always
it all bleeds together.
So there are, we can agree that like it certainly appears to be the case that the worship music is currently embroiled in a lot of stuff that we don't want to sign up to.
Yeah.
However, we still recognize that it's like powerful for a lot of people and maybe even still powerful for us. And then the question becomes like, one, what do we do about the content? What do we do about what do we do about like the things that are being sung or the communities that are singing the stuff? And like kind of like what is the goal in worship music, right? And so can you just like change up the words? People have tried to do that. One of the most interesting features, I think currently in this landscape is how the mainline churches, like they're almost like overreacting to evangelicalism by being
That's my
like,
sense.
the most boring they can possibly be.
Yeah, maximally
so
boring.
Really,
there was
really
a time
hard.
Jaffrey and I were at our local Episcopal church that is currently closest to our home that we really wanted to dig. It's this beautiful building, wood, beautiful wood building with like old chandeliers, like great acoustics, cool, like priests that we liked, a couple families, not a lot of young people, but like we were going to maybe, look past it. And then we're in there one Sunday and we're singing some hymn and Jaffrey and I look at each other and we're just like, who the hell approved this song? This is the most hard to follow, unmemorable. Why are we singing this? Who said yes to this? And it's like, guys, can we utilize some of this technology? Like I've been thinking of sort of like, if you think of it like an arms dealer, it's like if I have access to the really good AK-47s, the Russian ones, not the Chinese ones or whatever. I don't know what I don't know. I'm pulling from like Jackie Brown here. From the
where
90s.
are we going with this analogy, bro?
Can we get the really good stuff to the churches that are doing like loving, justice-oriented work? Like, we're basically what we end up doing is like quitting in protest, and not just quitting the theology, but quitting the aesthetics and the worship experience as well. And it's like, why are those connected? Why,
because they're like Tim, right? And so like they loathe what they see.
I think it's a trauma response, basically. Is
yes,
why.
but even people who have like kind of grown up in the mainline churches, they're for the most part super cognitive. The mainline churches are like pretty damn cognitive, like very much in their heads, and they need to learn a bit from the evangelicals and just like psychedelic science and stuff on this. They're super in their heads, and they are generally like less comfortable with emotion and like expressions of emotion because like they're often very well educated. They're often like at a higher like socioeconomic status, and these things are generally like linked with being super brainy, not being very emotional. Like it's like all like the stereotypes of like the academic elite, right? And so they're kind of snobby a lot of times. And I'm saying this as somebody who's like technically still a member of like a PCUSA church. So like I am a mainline person.
I get it. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't do mainline. I've been.
Okay,
I'm
well,
like,
say more about that.
no.
Then what do you do? Like, how do you like connect spiritually through music?
I rant online. That's how I connect spiritually.
You're looking at it, sister.
No, I mean, here's the thing, right? One of the things about me that's, I mean, maybe it's kind of unique. I don't know. Maybe it's not. It's that when I started TNE, I was still serving at my evangelical church. I was like still in, and I loved it. And my one of my things in the beginning was like, hey guys, not every church is so problematic. Look, my church makes room. And I was still navigating a lot of my own theology. I wasn't fully affirming yet, but I was like, I think we need to think about this conversation differently. But I was in.
When you started the new evangelicals, you were still an old evangelical.
Totally. The reason why I got the name was because of after the pandemic, I was so frustrated. I said, we need a new evangelical movement. And I was still thinking at the time, we can reform from the inside.
Sweet Tim.
Yeah, I know. But I mean, but to be fair, there's a very good chance that if my church did not give me an ultimatum to either stop drumming with them as a volunteer or stop this work online, there's a very good chance I'd still be there today. Yeah, because I have no problem living in like the tension of like things not always being completely coherent. Like I get that on one hand, I could struggle with like the emotional manipulation and still see, well, people seem to really get value out of this. And also as a musician, I love doing this. It feels like part of my act of worship, so to speak. I don't know if I would be there or not, but there's a good chance that I would because I loved it so much, right? So when I started TNE and all this kind of happened, and I'm like navigating a lot very quickly. I'm discovering ex-evangelical, deconstruction. I'm discovering accounts that are like, hey, racism, this and that. I'm like, oh my God, I have to learn so much. And I'm reading all these books. Like I'm just trying to catch up, right? And so I've always been very much in real-time process with my community. Like it's never been, hey guys, that was me 10 years ago. Let me light the path. It's always been, I don't know, let's find out together because I don't know how to reconcile some of this stuff. And I'm also working through the same questions that a lot of my audience or the community has. Mm-hmm. So, when it comes to like a lot of this stuff, ultimately, and I've told people this, I miss it. Like I miss doing the Sunday morning grind. I miss being there at 7 a.m. I miss sound check. I miss nerding out in Ableton. I miss playing the songs. They are well-written, fun songs, especially as a drummer to play. They are built for drummers. They are dynamic. They are powerful. These churches have high-end gear. Like you're creating this amazing moment every week. I miss it. And so for me, at this point where I'm at is I'm very much still in process where I have not been in church for the first time. It's been 3 years essentially, and that's the first time in my life I've been out of church like ever. And I've been talking to my partner. She's not really religious at this point anymore. She's a pastor's kid, and she's just like, yeah, I'm raising 2 kids, Tim. Like my mind is busy. I don't really care. You do your thing. But I'm at the point where I'm like, well, I do want to find an embodied community because digital's great, but nothing beats embodiment, right? Yeah. But I've told myself, I'm like, well, I don't want to go mainline because, and no offense to mainliners, to me, my brain was not formed around that experience. That just seems incredibly boring and dry. Sure. Even though I find a lot of beauty in the liturgy and stuff. But also, I don't want to go to some hip evangelical church and be told like all are welcome here, ... except if you're gay or too liberal or you think Black Lives Matter, right? And so for me, like the sweet spot is you have what is the perception of like a modern evangelical church that actually when they sing What a Beautiful Name or when they sing X song, Reckless Love, they actually fucking mean it. And you're like, yes, both and. And it's funny because it just seems like, I'm not sure why this is. It's interesting because to me, mainline churches look conservative and ancient, but oftentimes they're very progressive in their theology and how they're thinking about things. And these evangelical churches look so modern and hip and progressive and often are the most fundamentalist. And I'm like, can we just have both? I just want both. Yes. So that's where I'm at right now, still navigating a lot of this.
For like 10 years, yes.
The way that I explain that in American tradition to myself is to think of it as a big self-selection process in the 70s and 80s. That, we hear a lot about how baby boomers left their Catholic and mainline traditions to become evangelical, initially as Jesus Movement, Jesus People, but then, just the more non-denominational kind of heavy Baptist vibe. And those are the churches that grew steadily over the next 40 years, while all those mainline churches, and including Catholicism, less steeply declined. Yeah. And if you can think about that, theologically or whatever, but you could think of it in terms of what sort of a lived experience of faith is someone interested in. And the people who were interested in a more immediate, more all-encompassing lived experience of faith. They self-selected out of the mainline and Catholicism and into evangelicalism and eventually charismatic movements, right? And there's some bleed over between those. And they went for this other kind of a faith. Now, who does that leave left over? Well, it leaves in the mainline churches the people who already, had sort of like more of a civil religion. It was a bit more about being a good citizen. It was a bit less of a heart thing. And now all the heart people have left, or a bunch of them anyway. And with people moving out to the suburbs and the creation of the suburbs in the 50s and 60s onward.
The church growth movement.
Exactly, church growth. So all these things sort of feed in
racism.
To this self-selection, though. And I think that took place over more than a full generation. And so it's not like an easy solve to sort of get those groups back together again, right? That had already sort of separated out in these ways.
Can I offer one more thought quickly, Sarah? Do you mind is it okay? Okay. I think that's a good point, Dan. I think another layer to all of this at this point for this community and this audience is watching the ever-growing rise of the charismatic movement with the rise of Christian nationalism and how they are very much now intertwined. So like the newest data from PRI is that about 70% of Christian nationalists, which really means most white evangelicals who hold those views, actually subscribe to some kind of charismatic theology, whether it's laying on hands, prophecy, like it's very tied together. And that's the rise of the NAR, New Apostolic Reformation. So like there has been like, what was it, in the 70s when Time magazine said we're in the age of the evangelical. Now I believe we're in the age of the charismatic, right? I mean, even especially beyond America, the Assemblies of God is exploding. Charismatic theology, especially in the global South, is exploding. So I don't want to map my own context to the global phenomena of that. But in this context, there's such a link now for a lot of these worship songs that were written by Bethel and others that have now become sometimes the war cry of like your Sean Foyts and your Christian nationalists, right? So I think that there are just so many layers that have created this ultimate recipe for why people like me and others are just so adverse to this worship thing, even though I think deep down, many of us, we don't want to be. I don't want to be. I want to feel like I can cry on a Sunday morning because the song was so powerful and not feel like I was manipulated, but feel like this was good for my soul. I'm still very early on in that recalibration. I'm not there yet, but I hope to get there at some point in my life.
Yeah.
A concept that I lean on a lot, and I lean on this in my spiritual abuse research, but also just in thinking about this stuff with clients and on the podcast, is that religion is like nuclear fission. Nuclear fission, when done well, produces the cheapest and most abundant energy of anything we know how to produce until someone figures out cold fusion or something like that. And also, nuclear fission, when done poorly, produces nuclear fallout, irradiation of everything in a 20-mile radius, complete destruction of life in that area. Chernobyl, Fukushima in Japan. And that's what religion is. And the reason that religion is like nuclear fission, in my mind, is that because by definition, religion's stock and trade is the transcendent. It's whatever it is about the human experience that goes beyond the workaday normal stuff. Religion is the stuff in which we make sense of art, childbearing and child rearing, right? So transcending our own age by bringing this to the next generation. It lives on through us. Collective effervescence. Sarah mentioned this earlier. This is Durkheim's idea of like when the group becomes more than the sum of its parts. Jonathan Haidt calls this, we are 90% chimp and 10% bee, right? A part of us wants to be a part of a giant hive. Yeah. And the sphere in Las Vegas is a nice apt visual metaphor for the hive part of us. That is like the most hivey place you can go have an experience is at the sphere. Like we're fully ensconced in this communal experience where our individual identity goes away as much as possible. And that is just the stuff that plus ethics, morality and ethics is religion's other stock and trade, which tends to map on to our deepest reasons for living and pursuing anything. And so because of that, religion will always be like nuclear fission. It's like it's baked into the cake.
Yeah.
And, Sarah mentioned the episode about worship music where I had Elias Dummer on, a month or two ago on You Have Permission. And we sort of talked about this, that like his mission of the group that he's involved in, Worship Leader Research, I think is what it's called, is like, let's acknowledge this and let's educate worship leaders so that they know what they've got and that they're not using these tools blindly, but they're having some intentionality in that. And that's kind of where I think the dualism breaks down, because it's like, look, Sean Foyt is harnessing this power, in my opinion, mostly for evil. And he is probably an egotist and does not appear interested in anybody checking his facts or slogans. Right. And he has likely very much enriched himself in money and power. And so he's figured out a way to weaponize the nuclear fission. And some people are probably getting some benefit along the way, who are kind of not as clued into what he's clued into. But that's sort of the direction. But these weapon, this power can be used for good as well. And we don't win the war, so to speak, if we just stop using the weapon because it reminds us of the enemy. It's like, and the trauma response is real, and I want to be clear, like, listeners, if you find yourself avoiding certain kinds of church spaces or topics, if you have flashbacks of negative experiences when you go into these environments, like, those are PTSD symptoms. That's real. I'm not downplaying that.
Yeah.
But if we can get past that, or for those of us who don't have those trauma reactions, like, why aren't we just using the tool? Why aren't we using this power for something better?
Can I tell you where I'm at now?
Yeah,
All this?
I can't wait.
So Dan and I have talked ad nauseum about spiritual technologies and kind of the descriptive aspects of this psychologically, and also just done a lot of ranting about evangelicalism. But us having this conversation today is it's very timely in I'd say a positive and a very painful way as well for me. These past couple of weeks have been bringing together multiple strands of my life. So as I mentioned, I've spent most of my adult life working in the science and religion space. And in recent years, I've been focusing very explicitly on spiritual yearning, kind of what do people do with that longing in them? And kind of playing around with spiritual technologies as a way of offering some hope to people. And kind of as far as I got as of a year ago, maybe, was making a solid case, I think, for, you can be a theologically sound, ethically responsible person and intentionally curate experiences for yourself that they might change you, they might give you that transcendence and that belonging that you're looking for. But I haven't been satisfied with that because it doesn't really get at I don't want to say the metaphysics, but it doesn't really get you very far in terms of what you're connecting to, right? So I've been okay, what does my life actually look like? I don't go to church. My partner Andrew and I were both academics, very brainy, and both grew up in evangelical churches, are not in them now, and we will totally listen to worship music and I'll speak for myself. I will totally just end up in tears every time. But it's a private thing that we do. It's it's a little guilty pleasure almost. It's very cathartic. And so I've been evaluating for years now my own experience around this. I have worked, Tim, you mentioned a bit ago, how, you haven't been formed in such a way that you can really appreciate mainline worship, worship music at least. And it took me, I spent 7 years in Scotland and was very much in a traditional, sacred music space. And I've come quite a long way. I can now find traditional hymns and sacred music and choirs very compelling if done well. But, it's kind of a learned thing for me. It's not that gut level visceral thing that evangelical music has been. But in the last year or so, I'd say I've been getting increasingly dissatisfied. Okay, I've been working on the descriptive stuff, the psychology stuff, the theological justifications for intentionally curating experiences for yourself stuff. But is it actually putting me in contact with anything? Is there actually a being or a God worth calling God? on the other side of this, or like in this with me. I don't think it's just a matter of switching up the language of the songs. And like, certainly a big part of it is the community. Like, we are not just made to listen to like worship on our earbuds. Like, we're meant to, our AirPods, like we're meant to, I'm an Apple person, so that matters, that detail.
Same
we're not meant to just listen to music in private. Like, I miss the community. I really, really miss the intimacy and the community that I have experienced around these music spaces in the past.
Not to mention so many of the benefits of religious involvement come mediated through social support. That's true for adults and children. So that we also know that from the empirical research.
It's healthy. It's good for you. It's very good for you. So even just being totally instrumental about it, it's really good for you. But so this past week, my college mentor died very suddenly. He was a theology professor. I won't give any names or places because, you'll hear why. So I was, my best friend and a couple of my best friends and I were very close with this professor in undergrad. And the three or four of us together with him began basically a student ministry movement, right? And it was exactly what you're talking about, Tim, I got your name.
No
it was a neo-charismatic movement in the style of Toronto Airport Christian Fellowship. If you're not familiar with that, go read about it. Super fun. I've been there multiple times. So it's a neo-charismatic movement, lots of inner healing work, lots of laying on of hands and anointing and confession. And it's an incredibly intimate setting, right? And there's a lot I could say about the pseudo-sexual kind of vibes and dynamics and lyrics of those spaces. So for a variety of complicated reasons, halfway through my college years, I ended up deciding to not be a part of the community anymore. It was a tough decision. And I really, really suffered from that choice for like years following. I kind of like lost my whole community because they were all very much a part of it still. And it was one of the defining moments of my life, actually, saying no to not only like a music setting, a lot of this was around the music, but also a community that was like the closest, most intimate community I had ever been a part of. I don't think I've ever really found that since. Mm-hmm. Okay. So this is so basically all these strands for me, like the grief of losing these communities, like the harm that some of those dynamics from the communities, and also like some of like the lyrics of the music and like the theology that was being discussed, those things were harmful to me. They were not great. They really were, and they harmed a lot of people. And it, so untangling all of this has been incredibly painful. And so now it's all coming up this week because, the professor, my mentor, was a man that changed my life. I would not be doing what I'm doing now if it hadn't been for him. And this community really showed me what is possible in the spiritual world. And yet it really harmed me, just like the messiness of it all, and the bad theology, what I consider bad theology, and I would say some manipulation probably as well. And so all of this has been happening at the same time as I'm kind of like wanting to start thinking about these, what we call the normative dimensions of what worship music might be doing for us and connecting us to. And this is a live question, and I want to hear your responses. So so what are the resources? Like, is it possible, hypothesis, is it possible that that what we're singing about in worship is maybe not so important? Is it possible that the theology associated with that music in those communities is maybe not so important? Is it perhaps possible that what evangelical worship, and worship more broadly, does for humans is it cultivates a dispositional openness to what is, right? So many people who are in my space in life don't know what they are even hoping for when they're singing or praying to a God they might not even believe in. But they know that when they're drawn to worship music, or they're like secretly listening to it as a guilty pleasure, or even going to a church, they're displaying a sort of giving of oneself, right? So they are enacting a giving of oneself to what is. And they don't know what that what is often. But it's like a longing that's being operationalized. It's a desire. It's a willingness, especially in evangelical spaces. It's like a willingness to say, I am messy and I have yearnings and I'm owning those yearnings and I don't know what I'm going for. But like these songs have been curated to help me lean into my vulnerability and my willingness to give myself to something, to ultimate reality, to God, to people. There's a way that this music is perhaps manipulating us, but also just like very intentionally, like, I don't want to use the word priming because that's loaded psychological language, but like kind of priming or like goading us into what I think is a really healthy like human response, but also there are philosophical resources, and I won't get into them here, but there are resources for thinking through how just the act of opening in oneself and giving oneself then like makes you more likely to experience what is real or true.
I think there's psychological layers to that as well.
Yeah.
Tim, but I'll give you a chance to hop in before I monopolize the mic.
No, go for it. I'm listening.
Okay,
I have 3 thoughts I wrote down in response to your hypothetical.
Oh, I love
Sarah.
you, Ben.
The first is, I'll go in reverse order. So you say the songs are curated. I would say, yeah, they're curated over initially thousands of years, right? In terms of like, what's the kind of content that tends to make it into these songs over, many hundreds of years in different cultures. But then maybe, let's say in the last 40 years of contemporary worship music and stuff, that you could think of that as a kind of lowercase w wisdom tradition, a kind of peer review process, trial and error at the least, right? So the worship community has tried out thousands and thousands of different combinations over the years, and the ones that accomplish their goals, like those orders, are the ones that get copied, right? And so there is a little bit of practical wisdom in the way that a modern worship service organizes itself, right? To be effective at its goals. Now, and as we've already talked about, those can be nefarious goals, but even then they're probably mixed in with some good goals as well, which is like for people to feel at peace, empowered, whatever. The second thought, again, going backwards, is I thought of Daryl Van Tongren's work, a mutual friend of ours. Maybe he's a friend of yours and a friendly acquaintance of mine, but I'm working on it, Daryl.
Mm-hmm. He's the other one. He's so great.
I think we're getting closer. He talks about humility, and he literally wrote a book about humility, about being right-sized. And I do think that there's something, when you're talking about being open to what is, to reality, it might not be true that, like, for instance, let's say I just take a random Baptist Bible church, okay? Their theology would say that human beings were created specially ex nihilo, or out of the dust or whatever, universe ex nihilo, humans out of the dust, and given this particular thing and, this Spirit of God, and they'd have all these ideas about how that, they have all these salvation ideas about sin and sacrifice and propitiation of Jesus' blood. But if we just talk about the idea that, like, oh, maybe humans who have evolved to believe that we are the centers of the universe because that has helped us survive, maybe just reminding ourselves that there's like much bigger forces at play than my individual life and family and community and job or whatever. Like, that view that the Baptist has there, I could quibble, but I could maybe say it's like 80% right. That, like, it's 13.8 billion years and we showed up 200,000 years ago. And so that kind of right-sizedness of like the act of worship, even if we're getting some things wrong, might be fundamentally closer to the truth than a posture of like human utopianism or transhumanist utopianism or something like that, which is an alternative, right? Or a kind of conspiratorial aliens will save us, which is now coming in as an alternative on the sort of left and right, where the two sides of the horseshoe meet without reference to God. So there can be something good about that. And the last thing I'll say is it made me think about acceptance. And, I work on acceptance all the time with my clients. And a phrase that came up in a session or two recently was this phrase of, I'm going to give it to God. And I kind of chuckled. I don't even remember if the client said it or I said it. But I had a little chuckle at this old Christianese phrase that's so well worn. It's like I know it as well as the pattern on the bottom of a Vans shoe that's going to leave its footprint in the dust. That's a very 90s reference. Okay. But give it to God might have some weird kind of theology in there or whatever, but it looks a lot like I'm going to accept the parts of this that I can't change, which I am struggling tooth and nail to help my clients come to accept the parts of the world that they can't change. Now, so there might be more things tied to give it to God. Like a Christian nationalist might give it to God in a way that assumes a whole bunch of stuff that we really don't like. But there are these kind of built-in benefits that I could use psychological language to describe for some of this stuff. That's kind of what your hypothesis made me think of.
Mm-hmm. Yes, all of that. I'm taking notes. That's really good. Let's co-write an article together, Dan.
Okay, yeah. With all this time,
actually, I'm not even really joking. We should totally write about this.
We could write about it. All right. Mm-hmm. Tim, any thoughts on any of that?
It's one of those things where it's the farther I get away from how I grew up and the environment I was, the more I do see some similarities, like what you just said, Dan, of give it to God. You can't control things. I see the overlap there. It's just, and that I think, Dan, a while ago, you said something, I think with me on a podcast where you were what makes spiritual trauma or hurt or abuse, whatever language you want to use, so damaging. So it's like getting hurt at the hospital. Yeah. Right? You assume you're at a place where it's going to promote your flourishing and you only come out more damaged. And then I took your analogy even further and I said, and the doctors won't admit responsibility and blame you for it.
You can't even sue them for malpractice.
Right. You can't even sue them. Right. They're like, no, it was your fault. And
none of the churches carry malpractice insurance.
Right. And I think what makes me angry and what makes so many folks in the space I occupy angry is exactly that. Yeah. Where I think a lot of them go, there is some good stuff to this religion idea, this God thing, this Jesus thing, this feeling and belief of being part of something bigger than yourself. These are great things. What a shame if it was so fucked up for me. And now I have to rewire my brain to not go to this other extreme of it's just neurons firing off in our brain. It's just this ultra materialism or just ultra, whatever the term is, of just all we got is whatever's in front of us, and there's nothing transcendent about life. And because I am I can't shake the Jesus thing. I can't shake the something bigger than me thing. But to your point earlier, Sarah, I also struggle a lot with is there anything, one person being anything out there besides me throwing these thoughts out into the universe, thinking God's out there somewhere? And I think another part of this that, again, just makes it so hard is when you guys can relate to this, I think, as you grew up similar in these evangelical spaces. When truth is tied to fact in evangelicalism, if we can't prove that the physical resurrection didn't happen, we have no faith at all, right? When it's tied to historic fact, or when it's tied to that kind of idea, right? Of hey, if the Bible isn't historically and scientifically and morally reliable in all facets, dualism. We have no faith, right? When you have that, when it's tied to that, and then people who actually know their stuff are just doing what they do. Pete Enns is a good example of this. He's just being Pete. He's actually, we don't really have a lot of the archaeological data that supports the march around Jericho. You're wait, what? You're telling me that the data doesn't really support that? All you go to is, is anything true about this book that I've been told was God's word my whole life? Right. It's just so jarring, right? And so, I think a lot of people, they're all different stages of all this, right? Some people are new to this quote unquote deconstruction thing, and I use the term basement and house, right? Some people are they're fresh out of the basement of fundamentalism. They're breathing new air. Their eyes are so they're dilating for the first time. It's overwhelming, right? Oh my God, there's something beyond what I was given. And then there are other people who are a few steps in, and they're looking back at those people. We're all in process and progress. It's just, it takes a lot of time for, I think, ex-evangelicals who still want to hold on to some form of faith, in particular in the Christian house, to be able to recalibrate and be able to find the nuance between, I get maybe more than ever what so much of my evangelical tradition was trying to do. And I also realized more than ever how so much of it was weaponized to maintain a certain sect or a culture or whatever you want to call it that like was really damaging to me and a lot of people, even the ones who thought they were being benefited by it. Now, to your point, I don't want to discount people's experience. We do our best to say, hey, if you're still in that space and you have found flourishing, like I'm really happy for you. I really am. But one of the aspects of, in particular, this Christian, what I call evangelical fundamentalism now, is this need to bring other people in and to convert them, right? To make them assimilate into what is the true gospel, the true understanding of God, the true meaning of the atonement. And there's no room for someone saying, hey man, I'm really happy that you found a different path in your Christian tradition that brought you not only your own flourishing, but the flourishing of your queer neighbors. And I'm so happy for you. That isn't the take, right? The take is, oh, these worldly, godless liberals who have punted the true gospel. So I think a lot of us are just trying to navigate all of those things at one time. And then we see worship music and we're like, yeah, fuck that. Like, yeah, I'm out. Even if there is some reality that could bring a sense of like belonging and connectedness and embodiment, which last thought on this, I do think that there are a lot of people out there who are in a space now where they're like, I need embodied community. It might not be a church, maybe it's a bowling league, I don't care, but I need something and I need people. And I told my board this before. I said, listen, I'm glad that we have a private Facebook community. Term used loosely, community. I hate that wording for a lot of reasons. And I'm glad that people have found each other and they feel seen. But you're never gonna beat people being embodied. You're never gonna beat someone saying, hey friend, I'm going to Target. Do you wanna go with me? You're not gonna beat that. You're just not. And the other thing too, and I'll stop ranting about this, is when it comes to community, I think one of the biggest dangers about the whole digital community is that people curate what they want you to see, right? And so how can you have real community if you're not working through the grit and the tension and the times when your friend annoys you or you annoy your friend? How can you work through real conflict when you're behind a keyboard and you're reading everything in the worst possible or best possible light? Yep. That's honestly, Dan, what scares me about doing my work and being so public for my community is that, I try my best to be as much me on screen and off screen, but it's still, to a degree, a curated version of me. And people can easily repeat the celebrity megaculture, church culture vibe of like, ooh, a new guru who will give me new absolutes and new answers to all of my problems. It's like, no, you have to get your autonomy back and learn how to grow without a guru telling you the new absolutes of truth or Christianity to have, right? Anyway, that's a bit of a rant there. I'm sorry. But all these things, I do think they'll play a role in the bigger conversation that we talked about, which is the worship music, I think plays a role in out of many things that make us be so adverse to all of this. And a lot of people are trying to navigate that better path forward, but we're just taking baby steps, like one step at a time, because we don't want to repeat the cycles, even though, to your point, I agree, people are going to look back on us and say, what were they thinking? Oh, Facebook community groups, look at all the harm they caused. I can totally see that. And I hope though that the difference is that we're able to hear them and accept their critique and change and not double down and say, no, you just don't understand. Like you don't really get this thing, do you? Right? I don't want to have that kind of pride and arrogance that I see other people in church space have, going forward.
There are many deep problems here. The church worldwide will never be as well regulated as licensed therapists are. There will never be a universal ethics board to which you can lodge a complaint about a pastor. There might be one within a denomination, and that pastor is then free to start a non-denominational church. This is the Mark Driscoll problem. You can't get Mark Driscoll to stop being a pastor. It doesn't matter what you do.
I know.
He has decided that he will be a pastor and he will be one. And he will always be able to find at least 300 to 400 people who want to hear what he will say.
I wish it was that few. He has exploded online. He has almost 700,000 Instagram followers. 700,000. That man was platformed by Charlie Kirk. I wish he only had 300 people inside his orbit. That guy is exploding. Don't get me started, Dan. I will freaking rant about that man. The rest, I will just go. So do not.
So, okay. I was referring to the size of his church, like around the time Rise and Fall of Mars Hill came out. I'm sure I'd love to actually ask Cosper, probably off mic someday, how he feels about the role that podcast has had in probably making Driscoll much more popular than he was before, and wealthier and having more political power and all of that stuff because of the absolutely toxic culture into which that podcast arrived, which I think was quite well done, generally speaking.
It was produced really well. Yeah.
And given that it was not made for liberals like me, but it was made for open-minded evangelicals, I think it hit the mark. So there's just there's no silver bullet against that. Mm-hmm. Religious entrepreneurs, spiritual entrepreneurs will always be able to operate unless you have no freedom of religion, which is worse. Mm-hmm. So
100%. Yes.
So like, that's just the cost of doing business, and people will get caught up in it. And all we can do is a better job with that, right? There's no perfect job. People have to make a decision. The decision that I've come to that I feel pretty confident in, but it's not perfect, is like, okay, given my knowledge about spiritual abuse as the guy who developed the scale for it, and given my understanding of theology and a little bit of childhood development through the psychological education and stuff, I feel reasonably confident that raising kids in a mainline Protestant church is a relatively safe way to give them most of the benefits of religion. Now that needs to include that there are other children. There have to be enough children that they have peers and not only adults around. And then number two, there can still be bad actors, even in denominations that have more robust training around this stuff and better tools. So it's not perfect, but that seems to me to be like, that's sort of the bullseye in 2024 is like, find a if you care about, for instance, your children. It's not the only reason that people want to go to church, but it's an important one for me and a lot of my listeners. So if you want your kids in church and you want them to you want to pass them some of this heritage down, and maybe some other time, Tim, we can talk about what I just experienced the other night to be the deep, like, evolutionary power of my 4-year-old singing for the first time a particular Christian lullaby with me, and what that seemed to unlock in me. I'm still unpacking it. Okay. But like, if you want that, find a mainline church that is queer affirming and whatever, like, usually as our viral meme showed, Tim, there's a bunch of other things that come with that, and they are generally things that liberals like you and I are happy about. Yeah. And that doesn't guarantee they won't be spiritually abused, but it will mediate a lot of that risk and give most of that benefit. But that's not perfect, and that's not going to fit everybody's situation. And especially if you really want contemporary worship music, you're going to have a hard time finding that. So it's complex. It's a muddy situation in every way.
Yeah. Good talk.
Thanks, guys.
Let's do it again.
Yeah, love to.
I'm always game.
Talk about this for days.
That was fun.